Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon, or whichever time zone that you are in. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable on women in drug trafficking in Latin America. I am delighted to be joined by three wonderful participants in this panel. You have the bios in the website, but let me just very quickly mention their names and their affiliations. So we have the participation of Elaine Carey, who is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Oakland University in Michigan. She's a historian of Mexico crime, social movements, and gender. She is the author of several books, and I know we've been in similar conversations in the past, and I know that she has a very in-depth understanding on women's participation in the drug trade in Mexico and beyond. I'm also very happy to be joined here by Teresa Martinez, who is an assistant professor at the School of Social Science and Government at Tecnológico de Monterrey, Mexico. She coordinates research projects at Noria Research Program for Mexico and Central America, and is an associate researcher at the Centre de Recherches, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, at Sciences Po in Paris. And Teresa Martinez, I know she's been working on these issues as well. And we've been in dialogue together in other spaces, rethinking about the role of women, not only as victims, but also as perpetrators, and trying to bring a gender perspective to these issues. And last but not least, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Jennifer Fleetwood, who is a criminologist and sociologist that is at Goldsmiths University. Her research and writer centers on women, gender, and crime law breaking. She uses an array of approaches, including narrative, ethnography, and interviews to explore women's involvement in the drug trade, and more recently in responding to street harassments. And she's also author of a number of publications related to these issues. So as many of you know, we have an hour and 15 minutes to have this conversation. So what I would like us to do, since this is a roundtable, we don't have formal presentations, but rather I want to facilitate our conversation. So I'm going to start with a very general question, and if each of you in the number that I presented to you can respond to each of these questions with a max of 3 to 4 minutes, so just like very 5 minutes maybe, kind of like more like bullet points, just to kind of generate conversation. And of course, feel free also to comment on what your other co-panelists are mentioning, because I'm sure that you will find fascinating connections between all of you. So the first one, it's a very general question related to your research, and I was wondering, I mean, just for those of us that want to know about what you're doing today, and those that are joining us, if you can describe your ongoing research and tell us how your ongoing research complicates traditional or common understandings of women's involvement in the drug economy. What type of gender stereotypes does your research debunk, or if there are any that in any ways your research confirms? And I'm thinking here about division of labor, perhaps promoted by these criminal organizations, where the so-called domesticity of women is somehow exploited or used. And also women's position of power within the hierarchies of these criminal structures, or the visibility or invisibility of their activities. So if we can start, Elaine, I'll start with you.
Hi, everyone, and really pleased to be on the panel, and thank you, Gemma, for moderating the session and kicking us off with a really good question. So this reminds me, some of my work right now is returning to Howard Ebedinsky's work, his broad definition. He was a very good friend and a mentor, and he passed away earlier this year. And in part, I'm returning to that because of that broad definition as organized crime being non-ideological, hierarchical, with a limited or exclusive membership that constitutes a unique subculture, and but also that there's specialization of division of labor, and then he has other aspects, that they're guided by rules and monopolistic and things like that. But But one of the things that I think is really important is that division of labor. And my work initially started when I started looking at women was if women dominate the informal economic sector in much of the world, why wouldn't they be involved in drug trafficking? That was a basic question. And again, that comes out of kind of women and kind of traditional methodology in women and gender studies. You know, if you ask a different question of the same sources, you start to see women, you start to see those complexities. And so that's been, you know, an area that I've been working on for many, many years. But my work now is really looking at those overlapping organized crime relationships and networks, how these groups work together. And that can also be, you know, they have their own specialization of labor. You know, so you'll have large organizations working with other large organizations. They're building those cross-ethnic alliances, which does make them very hard to police. And women are involved. And so now my work is looking at not just women who are involved in Mexican organized crime groups, but also women who are involved in other organized crime groups as they're connecting and overlapping. So some of the work now I've been doing is looking at, so for instance, the Herrera organization, historically based in Chicago, as it built over the 1950s and coming into the 60s and 70s, of course, it becomes fractionalized due to policing, but their ability to work across ethnic divisions, very similar to other organized crime networks in Chicago, and that stretched out across the Midwest and then also went into the northern border region along the US-Canadian border. And so, you know, we see how they expanded into different states, also obviously having that relationship to Mexico, but also how they worked with outlaw motorcycle gangs, African-American gangs, Puerto Rican gangs, as well as white or Middle Eastern gangs, and continue to work with them. And these include both men and women. So this is a historical continuity, and there is that division of labor there. So that's something that I find really just fascinating. And again, that is, again, asking that different question, maybe not necessarily about women, but maybe more about that division of labor, and not seeing that these are silos, that these groups are organizing independently always. But in fact, they're collaborating and working together. And within that collaboration are these unique division of labor as they intersect, although they may still have, you know, really a vertical structure on their, say, their part of the United States or their part of certain areas in a metropolitan area or a particular part of the country. So that's what I'm working on currently, which builds on the work on women.
Thank you. Tere.
Yes, thank you, Gemma. Thank you all. For me, it's a pleasure and an honor to share the floor with you. Your work has been like really an inspiration for mine. I'll say that in my case, I am working with a very specific group of women that I argue that has been like neglected by literature, even the literature that works on women in drug trafficking. And I am speaking about the posh girls, las niñas bien, as I call them. So the high class level of women that are related to drug trafficking, either in a very direct way or that are around drug trafficking somehow. I conducted fieldwork in Guadalajara, and for me, those were unexpected findings because I was not studying women specifically in drug trafficking. I was trying to understand the links between the economic elite and the drug trafficking or organized crime. And out of the sudden, of course, I found women being part of this entanglement. And that's why I started like working on the specificity of women. So trying to understand the posh girls and their relationship with drug trafficking in Mexico, specifically in Guadalajara, I learned that there are some aspects that somehow support the gender mandates, coming from either the expectation on how women has to behave, but also that supports some of the findings of the literature. But I also found something that challenges somehow these kind of studies. So for the cases in which I have like the same gender mandate, has to do with, for instance, women that participate or that are related with drug trafficking through the role of running a philanthropic organization, for instance. So that has to do with care, giving, and the whole idea of this activity as a female activity, right? But it's also a good opportunity to participate in money laundering. It's a very good spot to do it, and to be ignored by the authority, for instance. Then I also witness how the kinship bonds are really important to understand their relationship with drug trafficking organizations. Mothers, sisters, daughters, wives, girlfriends are related to drug trafficking also because of these kind of relationships. But I also found something that it's quite challenging for what we understand on women, that it's, first of all, the idea they are somehow committing a triple transgression, what I call a triple transgression. The literature, as you know, says that women in drug trafficking or women in violence are somehow behaving this double transgression, since they are challenging the gender mandate and the social mandate. And I argue that they also challenge the class mandate, since these women of upper class are the epitome of civilized and good-mannered women that apparently they don't need to be part of an illegal underworld, right? Because they don't have the necessity to get some illegal benefits or profits, because they have their life somehow resolved. But they in fact are part of drug trafficking organizations, at least they participate. And also I found a case in which one of those women are able to perpetrate, or at least to order to serve herself from drug trafficking violence to have some benefits. So this is the second challenge. They are also these violent entrepreneurs. And with these violent entrepreneurs, I am also playing on words with bulk of term of violent entrepreneurs, but also with this idea of them being part of the upper class.
Thank you, Tere. Thank you so much. Jennifer, please.
So my project was looking at women's involvement in drug trafficking, and I did fieldwork in Ecuador. The reason I need to explain this is that the respondents were from all over the world, not only from Latin America. But when they were trafficking drugs, they were doing that in Ecuador. So they're working as drug mules in Ecuador. And I think that kind of context is important. The literature at the time, and I think we still see these stereotypes emerging, is that women involved in drug trafficking as drug mules tend to be depicted as involved passively, accidentally, or due to coercion. So there's this thing of them kind of being tricked, trapped or compelled into the drug trade. And this figure of the drug mule is the poor woman who's forced to swallow capsules of cocaine, I think looms large as this kind of image of feminine exploitation. So she's presented as a mere body, she's quite empty, she has no will of her own. And whereas men in the business tend to be presented as the brains, their bodies are absent from scholarship. They are, careful calculators. They are masterminds of business and finance and international capital and smuggling. They're super smart, we're told. So my research kind of wanted to pull that apart, and I focused really on the work of drug mules, which is at the bottom end of the trade, which was not given that much scholarly attention. Most research seemed to be interested in the brains, the economics, the politics of the business, rather than the work that's done at the bottom, which was seen to be unimportant or uninteresting. But I think it is interesting, actually. I think if you think about the shape of a drug, you think about the shape of the pyramid, even if we accept it's a pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid is really fat compared to the top part, which is really small. So actually there's a kind of a rationale for studying these experiences. But the big finding here really was that gender mattered much less than you would have anticipated, or that I anticipated. I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. So there's one guy that I spoke to who was from Italy, and he traveled to Latin America, had a brilliant holiday with his friend. At the end, his friend said, I've just got this one thing that we have to do together. And they both swallowed capsules of cocaine together, but they learned how to make them, went back to Italy, sold them. And then that was what he did. He would travel back 2-3 times a year to have a lovely holiday and live a lovely lifestyle. And he was big. He was really like a very tall man. So he could swallow 1.5 kilos, which is quite a significant amount of cocaine. It's a lot. He was really big. And he told me a funny story about making the capsules, and then they drove a lorry over them to check they were safe. Who knows? But he is still alive today, and is an entrepreneur in a totally different setting. But for me, it was a reminder of actually the person who's trafficked, the person who swallows the drugs. There are many different stories behind that. There's him as a kind of very clear picture of agency, whereas there were women who carried often quite large quantities in suitcases, which is mundane. It's that less obvious form of exploitation, but there are forms of exploitation within that, because when the drugs arrive in a suitcase, there's no possible way of understanding what you're carrying or how much. So people were told you were carrying, 500 grams of cocaine, and then they would just discover they were carrying 5 kilos of heroin. And depending on where they were flying, that difference in quantity would have very, very serious consequences indeed. And I think the best parallel here really is if you think of people working in like an Amazon warehouse, it doesn't really matter whether you're male or female or what your educational background is. There's a role and you do it, and it's exploitative and it's coercive. And I think for me, that was the best way of understanding the ways that the work of drug mules both is and isn't gendered. And I could say more, but that's the kind of the big one I think I'll go with there. I've got something else on my notes, but I'll wedge it into our discussion later on somehow.
Yes, no, that's excellent, and that's a very, very rich way to start our conversation, and actually to get us started with the sort of like second question that I have, because many of you have referred to this, like silences or like the role of women like being conceived as like secondary, marginal, non-important, or again not being connected to questions of agency. And I have to say, by the way, that I'm very pleased that I know that in this conference now there are a number of panels analyzing the role of women in organized crime in different contexts, and that is really enriching, and that's just a testament of the very interesting work that is being done, but also like the more traction that this topic is getting, and I'm very pleased to see that. So the next question I have was sort of like about the challenges you have encountered. I mean, both methodologically. I mean, and I know that all of you work with sort of like different approaches and methods, but also in terms of the mainstream like concepts of organized crime, violence. I mean, what gets to be treated as a relevant story or a key aspect to understand the trade, or to organize to treat organized crime, what gets to be excluded. No, I mean, and how does your research not only brings women to the table, but also problematizes how we conceptualize organized crime and violence even. No? So if you can talk to us a little bit about that, and I'll start again with you, Elaine.
Thank you. Thanks, Gemma. And I do want to kind of touch on some of these things because I think it does fit in those methodological questions. And, so as a historian working on organized crime, there's the great archetypes of organized crime, the outfit, the syndicate, Murder Inc., and now, the Sinaloa drug cartel and others, right? So there's these archetypes. And they have repeated in history. But what we also realize too, it's not just about women who were disappeared from those narratives, but also other organizations, especially older. So African-American run organized crime groups were never recognized as being quote unquote organized crime. Right? They were, because it was to almost minimalize the work that they were doing. So this is the same thing with a lot of the literature in the 50s and 60s and 70s looking at Mexican organized crime that was operating in the United States. And there are these racialized tropes that are there that are saying, well, you know, a cook that's happening, that is undertaken by a Mexican is going to be really rudimentary. It's going to be filthy. It's not going to be scientific. There aren't going to be any real chemists in the room. But if a French person is doing it, then it's a whole different level, right? So there are all these aspects, and you can see this repeating. And so part of that was, in many ways, that undermines, if these groups, kind of these larger groups, aren't even considered organized crime, women who are working within those would also be completely disappeared, right, from the narrative. And so I think that's part of, that's one of the areas that I really like to work. And, you know, drug traffickers, until very recently, don't give their papers to archives. They're not, and if there are materials, they're not in finding guides. They're not going to be digitized if it's about women, and if it's about Black organized crime, or it's about Mexican organized crime in the US, right? It's going to be Al Capone. It's going to be others that are digitized. And so this is that real hard work for historians of really getting into the archives and digging into that material and piecing it together across place, because you're not going to find everything in one place, and it's not going to be digitized. And what is digitized is really reading against the grain and really digging into those massive, massive hearings and reports and things like that, which I've used extensively. The other thing I think we're up against, and this gets to the point of that Jennifer and Teresa were talking about, are these perceptions of women and the role. And so to constantly minimalize, you know, what is the role of a daughter? What is the role of a mother? What is the role of a wife? Also to say things like, well, women get into these positions of power because they're associated with these men. Well, same thing with Chapo Guzman, right? His dad was in the trade. But we don't sit there and say, well, you know, he's really not that great because his dad was there first. But we do that with women. And we do that frequently with African-American organized crime and Asian organized crime and Mexican organized crime that is operating particularly in the United States or in Canada. And so I think those are some of those things where you really have to be interrogating those sources that are coming from, as a historian, interrogating those sources that are created by the state and reading them with a different concept of what you're looking for, and trying to pull together, you know, pull those apart while at the same time piecing together these really, in many cases, very complex narratives. And frequently when you're doing that, you're the first one who's ever doing it. So there are benefits to that, but it's not as easy than if you were just like, what's been digitized by the FBI? You know, so those kinds of things I think make it more difficult.
Thank you, Elaine. It reminded me of some of the work that I've done. It's also, I mean, the sort of like famous cases of so-called criminals are those that emulated, you know, like the gangster in Chicago or the gangster like somewhere else. No, I mean, so those were the figures that were important for the literature. Tere.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I agree. I totally agree with Elaine. Somehow what we have is the eccentricities. And in my case, posh girls are not even eccentric enough to appear in some of the sources that are at least the classical sources for when we are trying to understand drug trafficking in general, and women who participate in drug trafficking is even worse. I mean, it's difficult to find cases in judicial archives or even in first-person accounts, because no one is going to tell me, you know, I am using my philanthropic organization to you know, clean some money, or we are like being part of these organizations. Also because they have this class mandate. But other authors, such as Elaine, had proved that drug trafficking is cross-classed. What I had as a challenge was to trying to give more evidence and to try to understand how that happened. But I am working with a kind of an open secret. So let me put it in this way. I don't have a smoking gun. What I have are mostly rumors and gossiping and stories coming from here and there, third-person accounts that I have to cross with others. But it also works with men when I am trying to understand the link between economic elite and drug trafficking. No one is going to accept that it's being part of this business. So I am trying to build on these kind of sources. So this is one of the most important challenges, of course, and trying to be rigorous, even if I am working with open secrets. And not trying to get the accounts because probably I won't. And the second thing that I'll say as a challenge has to do with the main notions that we have on organized crime and also in social class. What I found mostly is that trying to understand the social class acts crossing drug trafficking. What I found, it's kind of a confusion between social class and hierarchy among the organizations. So what we have, of course, are women who are kind of growing up in the drug trafficking organization, becoming from mules, for instance, to leaders or something like this, eccentric women, by the way, but not exactly women who grew up, who was born and grew up in high-class society and then started working with drug trafficking. So for me, it's sometimes the other challenge is to remain in my concept, to be with my concept of social class, which is not hierarchy inside of the organization, but social class, which is part of the society, not part of the drug trafficking organization.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Two things. So I'm a sociologist, and my approach usually involves trying to speak to the women who are involved themselves. And there are some particular challenges about this. One of them is in my first project where I was relying on women who were in prison. There were really strict gendered codes about how women and men could speak about drug trafficking, right? So everyone knows that if you're in prison, speaking about drug trafficking or being a snitch is very taboo, right? Everyone knows that. But there were different rules here. So men could claim to be experts in drug trafficking. They could say, oh, I was involved with a cartel, and they kind of have this social capital about hinting about all the things that you've done. So even better if you can get someone else to talk about how you're a big guy, right? That would be the ideal. Whereas in the women's prison, everybody claimed to be a mule. Everybody claimed that they were exploited. Everybody claimed that they didn't know what happened to them, because that was a way of conforming to normative gender expectations that women are not criminal, right? Because to be criminal, to be involved in this organization that is extremely taboo, that's violent, deeply clashes with gendered expectations. And there were kind of particular politics within the prison where prisoners were campaigning for better living conditions, right? So this was a place where people were being housed in extremely overcrowded accommodation, without proper sanitation, without adequate food. Guard brutality was a reality, and people died from lack of medical attention, right? So I'm not saying that women were just saying that they weren't criminal just to look like good girls. Actually, there were really pragmatic material imperatives for women to tell collectively a story about themselves as non-criminal and therefore deserving lesser criminality, right? But there's a challenge for a researcher in that context about how you invite women to perhaps speak about drug trafficking in different terms that negotiates with that taboo. And that, in my case, involved often inviting women to reflect on what could and couldn't be said in prison and the ways that their stories figured publicly. Sometimes women were even called upon to tell their story publicly to journalists or visiting dignitaries or other kinds of things. And when I started to speak to the wrong kind of women who were racially minoritized, who were violent, who in prison, who were lesbian, I was called up into the office of the governor to inquire about what on earth my research was doing. Because before then, I was the nice white foreign researcher and nobody was troubled by me. But the minute I started to speak to women whose stories troubled that easy idea about women as good, I found my own speech being curbed. And in fact, I was not allowed to take a tape recorder into prison after that. So we had to do everything with taking notes. A second challenge is although prison is a very good place to find people who've been involved in drug trafficking, particularly countries like Latin America, being able to formally interview over 30 people and speak to many, many more over the course of a year and a half. Fantastic. But let's also remember that to some extent, these are failed criminals. So for men in prison, incarceration was part of a long criminal career. So for them, not so troubling. But we could say that they were failed criminals in some respect. So I did a project in England looking at men and women involved in the street level crack cocaine and heroin trade. And these are women who had not been arrested, who had not come to the attention of the police, who'd been involved in drug dealing for a while. And most of them were out of it. And they were very successful criminals, right? They made money out of it. It allowed them to meet particular career goals or personal goals. They went in, they got lots of money, they spent the money, they had a good time, then they stopped. And this is not what we think of as a successful criminal. We think of a successful criminal as people who go up the career chain, who climb the ladder. There are these parallels with formal business, as if formal business and informal business are, mirror images of one another. But the business that they spoke of there was something that was informal, non-violent, non-hierarchical. There was no pressure for them to get in. There was no pressure for them to get out. And it was a very different kind of model of organized crime than the literature suggested. And sometimes I wonder about how our scholarship is skewed by particular groups of people who law enforcement identify as being the criminals. And even with speaking to men, there were men who said, yes, there used to be cartels. Now there are kind of cartelitos, these smaller things. But so maybe those cartels do exist, but I think there's a huge cloud of people who are involved in trafficking drugs who are not formally connected to any organizations that often we kind of miss. And I think we could ask questions about whether these more networked and flexible kinds of organizations offer women different kinds of possibilities than those more hierarchical, formalized kinds of cartels. But I think that's a question that we would struggle to answer, I think, because the methodological problems there are so difficult, trying to find out who these people are who we don't know about. Difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for these rich answers, and I've been taking notes, and I'm sure like those that are joining us in this conversation are also very interested in continuing with more Q&A. So I just want to tell people that are joining us or remind them that you can write your questions with the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I know there are already a couple of questions there. I will leave some time like before we finish, around 15 to 20 minutes before we finish, to allow some time for the participants to respond to your questions. So please feel free to add more questions. And I just wanted to, I think it's fascinating, like, to hear like these methodological challenges, but also like the sort of like different silences that you're referring to. No, I mean, and from the silences of the archives, no, I mean, and also what is considered to be like relevant or not in the kind of like big history of crime or organized crime, to the sort of like rumors and gossips that Teresa, you're mentioning, and also, of course, there is like a hierarchy of credibility when we talk about, like research writing, research making, where like these sort of sources, no, I mean, are themselves quite gender, no, I mean, like who tells the gossip, and what kind of credibility do these sources have? And then I really like this question that Jennifer is posing in terms of like the silences from women themselves. No, I mean that that strategically place their stories as somehow like being exploited, and the strategic reasons for doing so. No, I mean, like very, very strategic reasons for doing so. So let me now move. You already touched upon a little bit on this, no? Because of course, like these are women that have agency, you know. I mean, that like sure, without denying like the kind of dynamics of exploitation and violence that exist in many of these groups, and outside, of course, as well. But clearly, like you're like bringing kind of like the complexities of this of these figures of these women. So I wanted to ask you, how would you say that these women negotiate, resist, or capitalize gender norms or expectations within these organizations, or also vis-a-vis state authorities? No, I mean, and I know that, I mean, in the past, we've had conversations with Elaine and with other scholars that are working on these issues, how, you know, like authorities do not, you know, think about the participation of women beyond the mules, no? I mean, and so there are like all these sort of like spaces of opportunity, because precisely like they are able to navigate without being noticed, because they are simply not thought as capable of occupying positions of leadership or like being involved in money laundering. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I'll turn to you again, Elaine, to start.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, so historically looking at women who were operating, you know, in the past, in, you know, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, in the last century, they had endurance in many ways, and women continue to have endurance. So whether, you know, if you're looking at like Eloise Dunlap and Bruce Johnson's work of women in the crack industry, and they have tremendous endurance compared to men. In part because, you know, they also, you know, they may have challenges within their own organizations or outside. And so, you know, a woman who might become too successful is going to attract more attention, and that attention could be negative. So growing the business incrementally, growing the business alongside men in the family, a partner, can actually also, you know, it can help build the business. I mean, we also know that drug traffickers will marry each other for consolidation of power and influence, particularly those who are elite will marry each other, and that gives them, you know, a greater range and diversification even within the business. I think that women also have, you know, looking at the contemporary and working with and getting to kind of look at these, how organizations are working together, you know, that are standalone but also collaborating. A couple of patterns are emerging. You know, one is technological advances have allowed women to take on different types of leadership roles in that diversification. So for example, money laundering, banking, all of those things. And obviously access to firepower, right? So women can be assassins just as much as men. No one's having a boxing match or a duel, right? It's something else. So women can access those too. The other thing is that what we're seeing too, and I think this is something that's more in this particular century, is women having higher levels of education than men within the organization. And this isn't unique, you know, because again, being involved in money laundering and running the legitimate businesses, this isn't something that's just that was happening for decades, and that meant women were kind of in the shadows of the business because the men were the more public figures, but the organization could continue when the men were arrested because of that diversification, but also those levels of education. And I think that continues too. So even looking at organizations that are operating now, and, you know, and I'll ask policing agents, they'll say, oh, there's no women involved. And I'm like, who's running dispatch? Who's keeping the books? And then they're like, oh, it's the wives and the daughters. And all of a sudden asking that different question. So I think that is There's expectations that women are supporting the family business, highly gendered. They're more educated than the men. They have a different role. And so I think that's been evolving over time. And I would say in my early work, looking at, say, early women in the drug trade, they were not more educated than the men. They maybe were educated in the informal economic sector, but now we do see that. And that's rippling across different organizations and in different places.
Thank you, Elaine. Teresa.
Yeah, well, in my case, let me make a link with the previous question and what you said about the credibility of the sources when we are talking about rumor. I think that it's important to avoid the speculation and then to build the idea of the conditions of possibility. So most of the times when I am trying to discuss my work, people ask me if they don't have the necessity to be part of the drug trafficking, why they do it. And normally my answer is, why not? If they have everything, like all the capacity and the position and the capitals and the opportunity and the agency to do so, why not to do it? And I think that that it's related with your question. Since women are seen as harmless, I think that's a perfect space for them to operate and to do things that normally authority or even scholars or everyone is paying attention on men. And this is very clear for the financial crimes. And of course, the legal business are very, very important for this part of the value chain of drug trafficking. And women are perfect, not only because they are good with numbers, although they are not considered to be good with numbers, but they are, in fact. And but also because the kinship bonds, the kinship relationship made them perfect, for instance, to, as Elaine explained, to run the family business. And that's why you can see sisters and brothers and, sisters and daughters running the business. And not only that, but also to be part of, and I am going to insist with the philanthropic organizations, which is very gendered field. And it's even clearer the idea of the harmless. Those are the women doing the best part, the best phase of the humanity. They are those women, like in a classic way, like they have been doing this kind of caregiving for the whole life, right? So they are not really challenging the gender stereotype, but they are doing, in fact, because they are participating in money laundering in that sense. So this, what Lamont called this phantom narrative, since women are not like in the spotlight, being questioned, for instance, or being hunted by law enforcement, gave them, in fact, the whole opportunity to do whatever they want. And even if we can understand the participation of posh girls into drug trafficking related with men, because their relationship with men, we also can see how we are talking about agency here. They are there because they choose to be there. In many, many cases. So I think this is the part that in which it's fascinating how to prove that in fact the bias is much more than of the field.
Thank you. Jennifer.
I mean, I think in my research, I found that in the same way that the gendered assumptions are part of our daily lives, they are deeply infused in all aspects of the drug trade. So, for example, with recruiters, they would look for people who they thought would kind of be recognizable at customs and would pass. So they were looking particularly for young people, Ecuador being a place where lots of North Americans would come to learn Spanish. So great. Do they look like they're going to language school? Great. Are they studying? Great. Perfect. So they're playing with those gender roles. And I think women themselves were often motivated by traditional ideas about women as providers for their children and families. at the same time as they were, for example, experiencing domestically violent relationships at home, unable to access education due to, racialization and gender, racial stereotypes. But that doesn't mean that people always kind of accept those things passively. There was one woman who was from North America, her family were from Puerto Rico. She had her first child when she was 14, so she didn't complete her education. She was in a domestically violent relationship. Her partner accrued huge debts, and this was a way for her to solve her debts very quickly. And she knew somebody who knew somebody. And she recalled being in the plane as she left the United States and thinking, like, bye to my life. Her children that she cares for dearly and will, risk her life for, but also to be free of them for a little holiday was also something that was meaningful for her. So these things are constantly present and constantly worked with. There was a lovely paper by Jodie Miller and colleagues that looked at women involved in the street level drug trade and the ways that they use gender stereotypes. So, for example, there was a woman who would throw a barbecue as a cover for her being able to sell lots of drugs at one time. And in the UK, we found really similar things of women selling drugs while they were in supermarkets, pushing a pram or pushing a food trolley, because that's what everybody thinks what they're supposed to be doing. But also those were the things that those women were actually doing. They also did need to go to the shops and they had to pop out for milk. So these things I always think of as kind of ever present and unavoidable. And I agree with the things that other people are saying very definitely ring true, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. These are all very interesting questions too, or like reflections. And I mean, one of the next questions that I wanted to ask you, and I think the way that you have approached this topic and the sort of like connections with other sectors of the informal economy or other criminal activities. I think you already alluded to some of this, but I mean, as many of you know, there's been a sort of like shift in the scholarly literature where, we don't talk anymore about drug trafficking organizations, but we increasingly talk about organized criminal groups because we recognize that, especially in the Latin American context, they are not only involved in drug trade, but also in other activities like from extortions, human trafficking, arms trafficking, and other like more petty activities, that have to do with the informal economy. So do you think, or do you see women as having a role in this diversification, or is it through your work of studying women in organized crime? Does it complicate the notion that this is a recent development? No, I mean, and by understanding like women's participation in these businesses, can we then expand our understanding of like the many connections between the drug economy and other informal or illicit economies? Elaine.
So, organized crime has always been diversified. That kind of idea that, angels with dirty faces, Italian and Jewish and Irish organized crime are not in the drug trade until, very modern, maybe 50s and 60s, which is completely wrong, right? So it was part of a whole aspect of what they were involved with. So there was drugs, there was gambling, there was prostitution, there was racketeering, there was extortion, there was control of commodities during World War II, legal commodities. So they were always diversifying. They were investing in industries that, to help launder money, but also those industries might help facilitate their other illicit businesses. And we see the same thing, right? So, moving drugs, moving people. We know too, early drug traffickers were also involved in human smuggling. I mean, that's so I do think it's something that is historical. I think what happens is we have associated, particularly with Latin American organized crime groups, exclusively with drug trafficking, and not looking at the multifaceted and complex organizations that they have been and historically were. So if we're thinking of the Guadalajara organization, if we're thinking of the Herrera organization, they were involved in lots of different things, some illicit, some licit, but they had a portfolio of areas that they were working in and looked very similar to organized crime in Europe and organized crime in the United States and Canada. So I think sometimes we focus on one area and then we realize that it has diversified. And of course, as organizations get bigger and they're wealthier, they're able to go into other areas, whether it's in oil or certain agriculture products or some things like that. But I look at that as a historical continuity that women intersect with too, and always have. If prostitution was part of organized crime, which it was, women have been involved in that. And these other areas too, if we're looking at things like how do they control certain commodities, women were involved, either working on franchise or in consignment or things like that. So I look at it as part of this continuity that comes forward and people pay attention to it and then kind of disappears again. And that's just historical. It's been going on for decades.
Thank you, Elaine. Tere.
I love the historical perspective of this question. I have to confess that I am very jealous of you, ladies, because you are historians and I am not. So not being an historian, I'll say that in my case, my intuition is that the involvement of women has to do also with the evolution, or I don't know, the involution of illicit markets in general. In the 70s, for instance, we used to see women who participated in economic elites or in business sector only playing two main roles, either as office workers, typewriters, for instance, being trained by the Chamber of Commerce, or the wives of someone performing charity, right? So there were these two roles. Now, since we have women being part of many other different roles within legal markets, so it's possible to think that this diversity also has to do with different roles at the relationship with drug trafficking organizations. Since they have highest levels of education, if women in general have highest levels of education, the posh girls are even more privileged in that way. They had been trained in the best schools, not only in the country, but abroad, that gave them another possibility to be part of the most important industries. They also have access to the narrowest circles in the society, because they are part of these circles. So I think that gives them other kinds of possibilities and capacities. And I will develop a little bit the case of this violent entrepreneur who runs a company, a very male-oriented company, because her father, it's kind of a heritage, since she doesn't have brothers. So that gave her the possibility also to use drug trafficking to perpetrate violence to collect a debt. And this is something that we can see now, because now a woman could run a company, a very male-oriented company. Probably if she had a brother, it could be like another story. But what it's interesting is that now it's not that strange to see women that's true that it's the exception. Most of the women being part of running companies are companies gender oriented. But since we have them also in these specific companies, again, the conditions of possibility are there for them to use violence or to be part of drug trafficking chains.
Thank you. Jennifer, please.
I think I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea of there being organizations, right? I think the people that I've spoken to are involved in more flexible network type phenomena rather than something too stable, right? And I think we can think about the perspective of organizations and organizational change, but then I think another perspective is thinking biographically, and thinking about what do individuals do, and I wonder where that takes us. For example, Hattie and Pete Adler did an ethnography of cocaine traffickers in, I think, California, and they used this word oscillation to talk about people's journeys in and out of the drug business, and that being one hustle of many that people had. And I think taking a biographical perspective also reminds us of the fact that people's life circumstances change, their ambitions change. Involvement in crime might be something they dip in and out of or grow out of. And I find that useful to think about, and that rings true with women that I've met dealing drugs at street level and involved in kind of later levels. Some of them had previous biographies of being involved in other types of crime. I mean, I can also think of them being trying to come up with legal hustles as well as illegal ones, because nobody, I think, really wants to be involved only in illegal crime forever. I think often there's an ambition to not be involved in crime. So I don't know, I think there's an organizational perspective, but for me, I would probably want to take more of a biographical perspective.
Yeah, I very much like that. So we have around 20 minutes before the end of our roundtable. So I want to give an opportunity to address like some of the questions that have been addressed by the audience. I want to say that I do have a question that I wanted to ask, but I'll come back to it if we have time, and it's related to how like state policies have in a way, kind of like produce certain conditions that make the participation of women less or more possible. No? I mean, how those policies could change then in that regards. But let me read the first question we have. And again, for those in the audience, if you want to type your questions, we still have time, or I can gather a few. So the first question is from Frieda Garcia, who asked you, could you please share how your work intersects with the women, peace, and security agenda? So any of you that wants to address this question?
So I'll just jump in some other work that I've been doing, particularly with Patricia Figueroa, looking at women in policing in Mexico. And it's interesting because there is this view that that by bringing, because women are less, the vision, this is not my interpretation of this, okay, that women are less likely to, are less corruptible, and that more women need to be brought into policing. And so in Culiacan, outside of Culiacan, is a new police academy for women, and it's exclusively for women. So they're being trained, in a gender segregated educational system, for a police academy, in part because they believe that this might help. It might help with security. It may help to improve human rights, and also to struggle with against corruption. Along with that is bringing women into a SWAT unit, what it would be SWAT units, and for those very same reasons. But then that work is gendered. So on one hand, they're being trained, and there's this very kind of lofty ideals about women that are based on gender stereotypes. And then once they come into those roles, their work is gendered. So they're going to be more, in one case, one of the first SWAT women in what was the SWAT unit in Culiacan was the dog handler. So it's things, so it is connecting. So there's ideas from the state. And then obviously, I think there's a growing body of work of how women are responding and really, at the forefront of the peace movement and the human rights movement in response to drug violence. So they are, that is something too, that there's a lot of work that is taking place right now.
Thank you, Elaine. Jennifer or Teresa, do you want to add something? or otherwise, Tere, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I said that in my case, like it's hard to see the intersection between both, probably because with the case of the Posh girls, they are not even assumed to be part of a war or something similar of being violent. No, if the idea, if this open secret is true for their performance or their proximity to drug trafficking, when we talked about violence piece or I mean the peace building, they are not even concerned most of the times. I cannot generalize, but the way they approach this kind of perspective, it's again through philanthropy, and I think I talked about it enough.
Thank you. So let me read the other question that we have. Is from Jasmine Gonzalez. And by the way, both of them congratulate you for the panel for your interventions. So the question is: in addition to financial gain, family or romantic partner relationships with drug traffickers, and a sense of higher social status by engaging in criminal activities, what other factors are driving an increase in women's involvement in organized crime, especially in Mexico, Ecuador, and the rest of Latin America? So Jennifer, you want to start?
Yeah, I can take this. I think the first thing is I would challenge the idea that there's an increase in women's involvement in organized crime. I think if you think of like a small pie and imagine a small slice of that pie, and then think of a big pie and a slice of that pie, like the slices look different, but I think if you've got an overall expanding drug trade, there will be more women who are part of that. And I think the ways that we measure women's involvement is often through law enforcement, but actually the number of people who are arrested is really a measure of, particular politics or policing or geoglobal locations. So I think there's a lot of caveats to be made about, is there an increase in women in women's involvement? I'm sorry, Yasmin. I feel this feels like I'm being very mean, but I don't mean it in that spirit at all. But I think the idea that women get higher social status through engaging in criminal activities, I think, is not really borne out. I've met women who are very proud of their involvement in the drug trade, but not publicly. And I think actually speaking to a researcher is a rare opportunity for them to boast about their criminal pursuits. So are there now women more involved in organized crime? I think not. I think there may be policies that make women more arrestable. And I think there's a perverse issue here that I think us as researchers, campaigners, and others working in organizations need to be aware of. I mean, in the UK, since the 1970s, we've had more and more scholarship on women in crime and in criminal justice institutions, and we have an ever expanding prison population. So it's not to say that the more understanding, the less criminalization happens. Sometimes bringing attention to women's involvement hasn't necessarily always benefited those women. So I think I would be very cautious in assuming that there has been an increase. And I think I would not want my scholarship to be read in that read as a kind of evidence of women's increasing participation, because I don't think that's the case. So sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I think it's also a useful opportunity to really to clarify things. And I think we all come to this topic with different working assumptions in place. And I think my working assumption really is that women's criminalization in part of the drug trade has been hugely harmful, not only for those women in their communities, but also these are processes that undermine rule of law, democracy in those countries as well. So my intention is never to kind of make women more arrestable or say, look, gotcha, they're just as bad as men and they all need to be locked up just in the same way. I think that's not what I would want to say. So sorry, I've gone off on one, but hopefully that gives food for thought. And those are all comments that kind of are supportive. And I think I want to challenge what our assumptions are. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. And since we have only a few minutes left, let me take your intervention as a way to sort of like conclude our panel and give Teresa and Elaine now an opportunity to either respond to this question or also like address like it's very much connected to what I wanted to ask you about the sort of like the ways in which state responses towards drug trafficking have contributed to the gender dynamics that exist, and or if you want to reflect on the what bringing the like sort of what Jennifer was saying. Oh, I mean, what does bringing the visibility or increasing the visibility of participation of women entail? No, I mean, for this sort of state responses that exist. So, Elaine, if you want to start, and then Teresa, and I think with that we close.
Sure, and I agree with Jennifer. I mean, part of working on women in the drug trade or women in organized crime is that they have been there and they're going to be there. And obviously the women who are at the top of a particular organization are exceptional, just as the men are exceptional. And that the most people who connect to the drug trade are users and are victims. And I think that's something, we need to keep in mind, men and women. One of the things of like why women go into the trade, and just historically, it's sometimes, they're brought by their family. It is the only, in many places in rural Mexico, it is the only opportunity. And not just in rural Mexico, in other places across the world, right? If you're a marijuana grower or a poppy grower, there's a hierarchy there on that production side. It's more lucrative to grow poppy. It's more lucrative to process it and move it, and it has been for many, many years. And so sometimes that's the only opportunity that is available in certain communities. And we've heard these conversations about why do people begin selling drugs in urban areas and things like that. So, it is part of that. And the policy question, I think, is always interesting, especially looking at how does the US historically perceive women, particularly Mexican American women in the drug trade. And their response was far harsher than it was of white women who were crossing the border and bringing drugs across the border. So, and so there are all these, how race influences this, class influences this question of immigration status. All of those those have really had an impact on the policy issues and in the US, but also hemispherically. And so I think those are things, we see a lot about, and this is in part what I think our work also does, is it interrogates those things as we're looking at the role of women.
Thank you. Tere.
Yeah, I think to add something to what Eden just said, I'd say in my case, we don't see economic necessity behind those women being part of drug trafficking, but we can see other kind of necessities. Sometimes for them being part of these organizations gives them what a conservative field denies. Even if they are part of the elite, they are still seen as, the imperfect male. So in that case, specifically, I'm thinking about this by the entrepreneur. It's a way to be to have more agency and more capacity to decide. As I told you, she inherited the company founded by his father, and in his account, in her account, she's always repeating how the shadow of his father is always there, and how she has to prove all the time that she is able to, and she's capable to run this company. So I think in that case, this is another kind of necessities that we, as women, we still have. And about policy, I think that in this specific case, we can see how policies specifically against financial crimes are not gender neutral, are gender blind, mostly. So I think probably that's why for criminal organizations, women running these companies are the perfect the perfect combination, because they are gonna be ignored by the authority. And this is something that Ceci Farfan argues, but also that I can also support with my own findings, no? The way they are considered like the mother of someone, the daughter of someone, and being that, they are not considered the ones running the illicit business that could be part of this chain of drug trafficking or money laundering. And I think that's why somehow policy makers are also reinforcing the role of women and the participation of women specifically in this part of the chain, because they are perfect to be there until we have these more kind of neutral or even gendered policies. So what I am trying to say is that somehow the state is also putting those women in risk, because since they are ignored, they are perfect to be chosen to perform this money laundering. And that's why they could be driven by their families or being part of the same business, because it's a very interesting way to gain weight into this conservative field.
Thank you, Teresa. Jennifer, do you want to add anything else in this last round? Okay. Otherwise, I think we're like in very perfect time to conclude our roundtable. I have learned a lot. I hope that those that join us and those that see the recording of this session also learn as much as I did and as much as I enjoy it. And I just want to kind of like finish with a very brief reflection of saying how your research is not only pushing us to understand what is the role of women in organized crime, but it's also pushing us to rethink the history of organized crime and understand its current manifestations. No, and I think it's something obviously that comes from your use of gender perspective. No, so you're not only putting women at the center of this story, but also seeing how that complicates our common understandings of organized crime. So I thank you very much for your participation, for sharing the knowledge with you, and I thank the organizers of the conference for this magnificent event. It's always a pleasure to participate. See you next time. Thank you.